Welcome to this VIP webinar brought to you by Your Personal Training. My name is James Lowry. I'm the Operations Director here at Your PT. This webinar series is part of our quarterly effort to get some of the best minds in the industry educating our trainers on a national basis. We are delighted to welcome Mr. Tom Stringwell to the VIP webinar today. Many of you will already be familiar with Tom's work from Your Gym Sports Performance, but the topic of conversation today is around applying plyometric training to your PT training plans. It's an area that, as fitness professionals, all of us will need to incorporate into our training plans at some stage. So with no further delay, delighted to pass you over to Tom to take us through this session.
Thank you, as always, James. I'm looking forward to delivering this. So yeah, let's dive in. So like you say, plyometric training is definitely increased in popularity. It's probably fair to say now that most gyms, most CrossFit boxes, etc., will have plyometric boxes. However, I do think sometimes plyometric training in its original purpose and the demands of it gets lost. And I think it's important as coaches, whether you're working with athletes or general populations, you understand the demands of plyometric training. So what I wanted to do today within this this free webinar is talk about, first of all, let's get an idea of where plyometrics originates from, what it is. The best way to understand any training format is to understand its origin, and then to talk about the demands of plyometric training, and then to talk about the models and the different methodologies we can use with plyometric training, and then to actually try and provide some nuts and bolts, some real world applications, which is, for me, is vitally important when delivering these type of webinars or lectures, that we give some. It's all right talking about training methodologies, but at the end of it, we need some nuts and bolts. We need some raw details of how to implement this stuff. So the guy that you can see pictured there is Yuri Verkhoshansky. So he was well, what we would now call head of sports science or head of performance. He was the head of performance for the Soviet Union. And if you look at training today, reps, sets, percent of 1RM, periodization, etc., it was the Soviet Union training model that formed all these guys. So Yuri Verkhoshansky was working in 1950s, and he developed a form of training which we would now call plyometrics. So the original translation translates as shock method or accentuated eccentrics. So just to give you a bit of a background of how it developed. So Yuri Verkhoshansky, he was given the lead role, which is crazy to think about now because there weren't biomechanists, there weren't sports scientists, there weren't physiologists, there weren't SSE coaches. He was all those things encompassed in one. And like I said, it's worth remembering this is 1950s, so the level of detail and sports science these guys were doing was unbelievable compared to what other nations were doing, including, you know, England. We've got athletes running around the field. These guys have got people doing plyometrics and replicating biomechanical demands. So he had the foresight to say, let's replicate the biomechanical demands of the athletes he's working with within the training to improve their performance. And he was given the role of working with long jumpers and triple jumpers. Now, when we are stood still, how much we weigh is our mass. However, our real weight is our mass times gravity, which is 9.81 meters per second. So this is why when you stand on some scales and move up and down or squat up and down, the numbers start to go all over the place because you're applying a force to the floor. So when you are in locomotion, this becomes important. So if you guys work with anyone that's moving, runners, anyone that's doing any type of change of direction or landing, this is the forces that's going through them. So what we need to do is take our body weight and times it by gravitational force. And even when we are walking at a steady pace, at the point of heel strike, you're around double body weight in force. When you start to run at a gentle pace, each ground contact is about 4 to 5 times body weight in force. So this is stuff that your clients are dealing with all the time. If your client runs or lands they are dealing with forces going through their body, whether they like it or not, and whether their body's in the right position to cope with it or not. Either way, it's happening. So the highest ground reaction forces in sports are the last impact before you perform a long jump or a triple jump, which is what Verkhoshansky was dealing with. And it's around 15 times body weight. So just think about that for a second. If, to make it simple, if you had someone that weighed 100 kilograms and they are performing a triple jump, when they make that last impact before they perform that maneuver, it's around 1.5 tons of force going through the body. In particular, the Achilles tendon that is dealing with that. That's what's dealing with that brunt. So we had the job of replicating these forces. So we use something called a force plate, which is what we use in biomechanics, which at the time was used in engineering. Then you had athletes walk off boxes of different heights and land on the force plate to measure the ground reaction forces, to then look to replicate it. And if you read the original transcripts, it is quite amusing. He said, we experimented with 3-meter high boxes, but the athletes moaned of discomfort, which is about a 12-foot drop onto the floor. Moaned of discomfort probably meant they injured their ankles and feet severely. But what he found were that if an athlete walks off a box of around 1.5 meters in height, when they land on the floor, they are around 10 to 15 times body weight. So here's a first take-home message. If you've got someone that is jumping on and off a box that's 1 meter high in a gym, every time they land, and this is Newtonian force, it's gravity, you can't argue with it, they've got at least 5 to 10 times body weight going further through their body each landing. And if they're landing with a knee valgus, that force is going in directions it shouldn't be, as an example. So what he realized was that with training, we can start to improve someone's ability to land and rapidly recoil and then perform another jump. So just to put this into context, when you stand to do a counter movement jump, if you swing your arms down for that downward phase, that's an eccentric movement. And then you rapidly change that as you jump to a concentric movement. But if you land prior from a higher height, that pre-eccentric phase is increased because you're landing from a height. This is why downhill running causes more DOMs, because each contact is an eccentric contraction. So we call this accentuated eccentrics, the ability to just rapidly convert eccentric force to concentric force. And he realized he could manipulate it. And from there, you've got a training method that can increase power, can increase rate of force development, how much force we can apply in a short space of time. And the research also shows prevent injury. If any of you guys have ever had an ankle sprain and you think it's been rehabbed correctly, and then you go to land on that foot and you realize it's not quite rehabbed, you need that ability to be able to spring, absorb force, and then rebound back up. Only then are you ready to start moving and competing again. So we know that injury prevention, plyometrics plays an important part of it. So what can we gain from this? Plyometrics training is demanding. It is very biomechanically demanding, okay? And there's some things we need to consider when implementing plyometric training. So like I said, the training effect and the mechanisms that we're getting from plyometrics is this ability to just rapidly convert eccentric into concentric ability. And when you guys do plyometrics, or if we ever take you through a plyometric practical session, you'll see people, without even thinking about it, you'll see them use different strategies to cope with landing. Some people will be able to land, maintain the same type of knee flexion and just propel into the next jump, where other people will have to land and almost absorb some of that force before they can then jump again. So it's a technique, it's a skill that we need to learn. If you're working with youth athletes, the best thing we can do is introduce them to this type of training at an early age. And if you ever work with a youth athlete that's done gymnastics or track and field as a kid, you'll see that they're just naturally springy. This quality has been developed, which then transfers to other sports. So we call this phase where we go from eccentric to concentric the aumatization phase, which sounds really fancy, but it just means the transition phase. And the more adapted someone is, that is reduced. So you can then propel yourself into a very high movement with a rapid foot contact. So if you think about an elite sprinter, the stats show that when Usain Bolt did his 100-meter world record, at his highest speed, he was covering 12 meters per second. And that's done with each foot contact's probably around 100 milliseconds. So in 100 milliseconds of foot contact, he's propelling himself at a ridiculous speed. That is pure power output. That's what we're dealing with. So during this phase, there's a muscle spindle, which causes a stretch reflex because there's a rapid eccentric contraction. And that then causes a concentric contraction. And then we have something called the series elastic component, which is your ability for tendon to absorb and recoil energy. And it's these two things together which provides this effect of plyometric training. And it's a training method that we can increase and we can develop. So it increases power and rate of force development. So this image you can see here, this is a bound, that's a sprint bound. That is a very hard plyometric. She's about to punch from a big height, probably around 10 times body weight of force through one leg, and then propel herself to the next jump. You guys that have done some track and field, you'll be familiar with this. For you guys that have not done track and field, if I got you to attempt this, you would see some very interesting movement patterns to try and cope with it, because these qualities might not have been developed yet. So this is what we're manipulating, this stretch shortening cycle. Now, another effect we get, a major effect we get from plyometric training is what we call musculotendon stiffness, which is the ability for your muscle and tendon together to just rapidly store and recoil energy. In particular, within the Achilles, this is very important. Now, quite often, plyometrics is only associated with explosive, powerful athletes. However, the research now clearly shows that plyometric interventions improves endurance performance. So if you guys are working with recreational runners that want to improve their 10K time, their 15K time, or whatever distance, if you implement some plyometrics 2 or 3 times a week and progress it, and it's the right type of plyometric, you will improve how springy they are per foot contact. To keep it simple, you will improve their ability per foot contact to absorb and recoil energy, which will improve their stride length and stride frequency, which will make them more effective runners. So this study here, if you look here, significant improvements in vertical jump or power, a bound test, 5 bound test, 3 kilometer performance, and running economy. And that's the key there for runners. Running economy means you can do the same amount of work and it's costing you less energy, which then means you can then run quicker because you've got energy reserves. So this is not just for powerful athletes, it's for anyone that's doing any form of recreational running. So when it comes to plyometric training, first and foremost, we've got different categories, okay? Different categories of plyometric training. So technically, if you go by the sports science textbooks, a plyometric is only a plyometric if it involves a landing prior to a jump. Now, that, in my opinion, is just someone being a bit too high rate. In reality, you'll often find plyometrics done where there's not a prior landing. So if you actually think about it, if you said to most people, plyometric training, tell me what you're thinking about, they will probably say a box jump. Well, there's no prior landing to that box jump quite often. It's just an explosive jump. Well, sometimes in sport, that's an important quality. If you're working with a rugby player, they don't do a prior landing before they engage in a scrum. They just go off the mark. Or when they accelerate, they just go off the mark. They just got to push from nothing. So those type of plyometrics are important. They're effective. What we then have is called tendon compliance. So I think the best way to explain this is to actually visualize you guys doing it. Imagine I've got you doing repeat squat jumps. And I say to you, every time you land, I want you to allow your hips and your knees to flex. So you're almost flexing down every jump and then rebounding and jumping back up. The muscle and tendon are working compliantly. It's called tendon compliance. And then the next category of plyometrics is called tendon stiffness, which is where I say the opposite. I want you to land and I want there to be next to no change in knee and hip flexion. And I want you to just to rapidly burst back up. Now, what you will find is that tendon stiffness is a quality that needs to be developed, and it's a hard skill. And what you'll find is without any coaching cues, most people will make it compliant without even thinking about it. And if I say to them, right now, try and have no change in knee and hip angle, so it's quite a jarring effect on your body, you'll feel the difference. And what you will find with the people that are just naturally powerful, this is what they'll do. Think about your friends or yourself. If you know someone that's just naturally powerful, with one little landing, no change in knee and hip angle, and the next minute, they're 3 meters ahead. Okay, this is what we need to try and develop in our athletes. So for you guys that aren't working with athletes and you're thinking about implementing plyometrics, it just gives us a bit of a progressive order. And I'm going to go through that with you guys more in a minute. So when we're selecting plyometrics, if you're working in sport, what we do is say, okay, what's the biomechanical demands of the sport? What movements does it require? And then let's look to replicate those in plyometrics. Now, for you guys that aren't working with athletes and you're just implementing plyometrics with general populations, what I'd also say is more important is what you need to consider is that individual's ability and their prerequisites as to how hard you push them with plyometric training. And this is why I want to go through with you guys more throughout this. So there's the differences between compliance and tendon stiffness. So with compliance, we have longer ground contact times. Now, when you actually look at that, it's 300 to 500 milliseconds. So it's not exactly sloppy. It's still quick, but it's just a little bit longer. And you get what you call greater joint displacement. So that just means change in angle, greater flexion. You know, there's a real effect of this flexing and extending. But with stiffness, we don't have that. That's the key. I say to you guys, make your ground contacts short, make them rapid. So when we're accelerating, when we're speeding up, our ground contacts are more like this. So these plyometrics become effective. When we are running at full speed, your plyometrics are more like this. So this is what we need to look to replicate. But for you guys that aren't working with athletes, just think about progressing people from this type of plyometric to that type of plyometric. If you're working with recreational runners, this is the quality that you need to be aiming towards by the end of it. But you might find that people need to start here first before we get to here. So this is a progressive order. We go concentric dominant jumps, compliance stiffness. So let me just put that more into more simple terms. Imagine I've got you doing broad jumps. No prior jump before it, just a broad jump. Just one broad jump at a time. Broad jump, land, make sure they can land properly, stabilize, rest, next jump. And you're doing one jump at a time. That's pure concentric dominance, it's concentric effort. And then say to you, right, now I want you to do repeated broad jumps. And when you land with each contact, I want your hips, knees, ankles to flex, absorb, and then go into the next jump. And then I eventually say to you, right, now do the same, but make your ground contact quicker. So now you start to see that me just writing repeat broad jumps on a program is not good enough, because I need more detail. I need to say, well, how do you want me to do them? Other things we need to think about with plyometric training, the type of forces that they're dealing with. And it makes sense that we've got a progressive order. Hopefully, it makes sense to you guys that we can say, I want you to be able to land from a basic height before I start making these plyometric boxes higher. We've got to go here before we go to here. It makes sense that I want you to do bilateral before you do unilateral plyometrics. Let's make sure we can land on 2 legs before we start doing single leg. We need to increase the difficulty bit by bit. And then we need to look at increasing the volume of how many ground contacts we do. So when you actually look at what the research tells us with plyometric training, there's an optimal amount of ground contacts that we can do for power output, but that depends on the athlete. So we'll cover that more in a minute. So here's a progressive order for an athlete or for you that's working with a client and you want them to do some plyometrics that are involving jumping up or vertically. So we go from counter movement to repeat counter movement jumps, tuck jumps, repeat tuck jumps. And then we started to get people to walk off boxes, absorb the force and then jump. We then do depth jumps. So depth jumps is Fishansky's original work where you walk off a box, hit the ground, let the hips and knees flex and then jump up again. And if you've got good power and stiffness, that jump should be higher than a normal jump. We can also do drop jumps, which is essentially stiffness, where I say, right now, walk off that box and make the landing quick. And if you've not done those before, that is hard. When I teach our practical days, I'll say to the guys, before you do this, make sure you feel up for it. Because if depth jumps felt hard, drop jumps are going to feel really hard, because I'm telling you to walk off a box, to have a ground contact that's very minimal, little knee hip flexion, and just propel yourself into the next jump. So it's quite a jarring effect. So hopefully that's giving you some idea of how we can progress as a basic level, some vertical plyometrics. Now, this is what the research shows in regards to optimal dose. 10 weeks, 20 sessions, 50 jumps per session. So let's just think about that. One exercise, 5 sets of 5. So 5 ground contacts per set, 25 ground contacts. Another exercise the same. So that's 2 plyometric exercises, 5 sets of 5. And the research shows if you can hit that 3 times a week, you're going to get some real power output. Now, before you all start trying that, I can tell you now that is a big dose of plyometric training. The first time you do plyometric training and you're doing some intense plyometrics, it's eccentric. So the DOMs that you get are massive, huge DOMs. And trying to do it twice a week becomes very difficult. So what I would suggest is initially you progress it in once per week, hit that for a 4-week program, then progress it to twice a week. If you are working with athletes, if I'm working with a rugby player and I implement some plyometrics, I need to make sure they can walk correctly before they start playing on a Saturday. So you need to think about how you implement it. So some prerequisites for proper plyometric training. Can someone land correctly? If they're landing with a knee valgus, that's a car crash. You've got medial lateral forces going through the knee that's going to cause an ACL rupture. And this is where I cringe, where I see people saying, I'm doing a Metcon workout where we're doing meter-high box jumps for 5 minutes. And every single landing looks like a car crash. Jump on a rower. Take the impact out. Plyometrics was designed to be done for explosive, powerful movements, to jump as high as you can, as far as you can, as quick as you can, not under fatigue. Yes, you can do that type of training, but keep the minimal dose, keep the boxes low. Don't have people trying to jump onto high boxes, and just make sure people can land correctly. Make sure they can move correctly. If they've got a prior strength training history, that will always be more effective because they can deal with these forces. Or they've done plyometric training before. Like I said, in an ideal world, someone is quite used to plyometric training and they've done it. So someone can cope with this training. So this is how it can be put into a program. So if you look here, it can be added to strength and power work. I would always do plyometrics first because they are very motor recruitment demanding, and then your strength comes after. Or they can be embedded within a speed and agility session, and again, the speed work comes after. So within speed agility, we can actually use plyometrics as a warm-up to improve what you're about to do. So this is how we can embed plyometrics within that type of training. So I hope that's provided some insight into plyometric training. It's not just about jumping up and down off a box. There's things to consider. Is the athlete or individual ready for it? Can they land? Have they got some good strength training qualities already? Have they got some stiffness? How hard's the plyometric that you're going to program? What's the demand you're going to do with it? How many reps and sets you're going to do with it? And remember what you're putting it in for. You're making people more powerful. You're not doing it for a Metcon effect. There is safer ways to improve someone's aerobic and anaerobic conditioning without ridiculous forces that can potentially cause injury. So I hope you found that useful, guys. And as always, if you want to get in touch with myself, you can either contact me through Aaron and James at your academy and YPTO. If not, here are my contact details. And I'm happy to talk about S&C anytime. So thank you, guys. And I'll see you next time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tom. That's a wrap there. Super stuff there, buddy. I think altogether made some valuable insight. Great point around plyometrics being, you know, useful for recreational clients as well, not just elite performance athletes. And I really like that progression chart as well that you detailed in the presentation. I thought that was fantastic. I think the risk you run as a PT is that if we put minimal research into the application of an exercise and then we just roll with it because it looks good and end up injuring the client on the back end, that's a negative cycle. So I think certainly having the progression, the layers built into that is a sensible approach when you start involving plyometric training into a training plan. But thanks so much for your time today, mate. It's been an absolute pleasure, and look forward to seeing you on the next call.
Yeah, pleasure as always. Thank you. Thank you for having me.